For 80 years, one question has whispered through hangars, veterans' reunions, and air museums. Which propeller-driven fighter was the fastest of World War II? It's a question born not from statistics but from fascination, from the smell of high-octane fuel, the trembling of metal under stress, the sound of piston engines screaming at the edge of physics. To answer it, we look only at those machines that truly lived fighters, that were built, flown, and tested in combat or official trials. No paper dreams or prototypes left to rust on drawing boards. These are the aircraft that carved contrails across the war-torn skies of Europe and the Pacific. Their recorded maximum speeds in level flight, confirmed by wartime data, are the measure by which we will settle this age-old debate. This is a story not merely about machines, but about obsession, the desperate chase for every last mile per hour, when nations wagered survival on engineering genius. And so our countdown begins. At number 8 stands Germany's Focke-Wulf FW190D9, the Dora. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was being crushed beneath the Allied bombing campaign. The Dora was born out of urgency, a transformation of the squat, rugged FW190 that had terrorized Allied airmen since 1941. Its heart was new, a Junkers Jumo 213A inline engine, replacing the radial BMW that once gave the aircraft its signature snarl. To house it, engineers stretched the fuselage and reshaped the nose, giving the Dora her unmistakable long-nose silhouette. The effect was dramatic. No longer just a low-altitude brawler, the D9 could now climb into the thin, freezing air to strike Allied bombers at height and survive the encounter. Production began in August 1944. Over 700 Doras took to the air before Germany's surrender. Pilots spoke of its improved high-altitude handling, its roll rate, its durability under fire. But they also knew, even as they climbed into the gray skies above a dying Reich, that speed alone could not turn back the tide. Imagine one of those pilots, 22 years old, climbing through winter haze near the Rhine. The Dora shudders under boost power frost, forming on the canopy edges. He sees contrails above B-17s, black dots of escorting Mustangs, and pushes the throttle forward. In that instant, speed is not a number. It is life or death. At number 7 comes Britain's Hawker Tempest Mach EV, the muscular evolution of the earlier Typhoon. It was the RAF's answer to a terrifying new threat, the V-1 flying bomb, Hitler's pulse-jet missile. With a refined wing design and the roaring Napier Sabre engine, the Tempest reached 435 miles per hour, fast enough to hunt the robot bombs over southern England. Pilots learned they could catch them in level flight, shooting them down, or even tipping them off course with a flick of the wing. Over 800 V-1s were destroyed this way. But the Tempest story did not end with the drones. It became one of the finest low-altitude fighters of the war, fierce, agile, beloved by its pilots. In the final advance across Europe, Tempest squadrons slashed through the Luftwaffe, protecting bombers, strafing airfields, and outpacing almost everything they faced. Many who flew her called it the greatest piston fighter Britain ever built. In both the Dora and the Tempest, we glimpse the paradox of 1944 technology, racing forward as civilization teetered on the edge of collapse, speed born from desperation. If you've made it this far, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Maybe you're a pilot, a history lover, or simply someone who still looks up at the sky with wonder. Drop a comment with your name, location, and tell me which of these fighters captures your imagination the most. By 1944, the familiar shape of the Spitfire, that elegant elliptical wing that once danced over southern England, had become something else entirely. The war had changed, and so had the sky. Dogfights now often began above 25,000 feet, where air grew thin and engines gasped for breath. To survive there, the RAF needed a new kind of Spitfire, not just a defender, but a hunter. Enter the Supermarine Spitfire, Mecca-Quotidian, our number 6, and the ultimate evolution of the legend. Outwardly, it still looked like a Spitfire, but beneath its sleek skin, it was an entirely different beast. Its heart was the Rolls-Royce Griffin 65, a monster of an engine, delivering more than 2,000 horsepower, twice the strength of the early Merlin engines that had once saved Britain. The new power plant demanded a sturdier airframe and a larger tail to counter the immense torque twisting through the fuselage. When test pilots first opened the throttle, the difference was startling. The Focke-Wulf didn't so much accelerate as leap. It could climb like a rocket and hold its own at altitudes that left earlier Spitfires gasping. First flown in early 1943, it entered squadron service in 1944, just in time to meet Germany's latest machines, the FW190D, the Me-262 jet, and the high-flying reconnaissance aircraft that tried to peer across England unchallenged. In combat, the Griffin Spit was everything pilots had dreamed of: fast, steady, fierce. It could intercept Me-410s before they reached the Channel, and even chase down the sleek German jets in shallow dives. German pilots, accustomed to outpacing the old Spitfires, were shocked when this new version closed the gap with relentless determination. To understand why the Focke-Wulf mattered, you have to imagine what flight at that altitude felt like. The cockpit shook the air, thin and biting cold. Every ounce of power squeezed from the Griffin's 12 cylinders mattered. Pilots managed their superchargers and propeller pitch with precision. One wrong adjustment, and the engine could choke. The Griffin's deep-throated roar wasn't just sound, it was survival. Around 900 of these aircraft were built before war's end, and they served with quiet excellence until the dawn of the jet age. But beyond the statistics lay something more profound. The Spitfire Focke-Wulf embodied Britain's unbroken spirit, proof that innovation could emerge even in exhaustion. And yet, as engineers pushed the limits of piston power, something subtle changed. The race for speed became almost philosophical, a war within a war fought not only against the enemy, but against the laws of physics themselves. To the pilots who flew them, these aircraft weren't merely machines. They were living things, moody, demanding, capable of beauty and terror in the same heartbeat. They measured their lives not in years, but in sorties, in seconds of turning combat, in the split moment between pursuit and destruction. Speed had become more than an advantage. It was a creed, a belief that if you could fly just a little faster, you might outclimb fate itself. By 1945, the war had entered its final feverish sprint. The skies were crowded with machines at the peak of piston-driven power, the last generation before the jet's cold breath erased the old order. Out of that final race emerged two aircraft that embodied very different philosophies of speed: America's Grumman F-8F Bearcat and Germany's Focke-Wulf Tu-152H. The Bearcat, ranked number 5, was built for one purpose: to be the fastest, most agile fighter ever to take off from the deck of a carrier. Grumman's engineers began with a simple question: what if we built an airplane around an engine and nothing else? That engine was the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800, a twin-row radial, producing over 100 horsepower. To harness it, they stripped away every unnecessary pound, sculpting the smallest possible airframe that could still handle such raw force. The result was a compact fury. The Bearcat could rocket to 10,000 feet in barely a minute, and a half, a climb so violent that test pilots joked the horizon disappeared before the instruments caught up. It rolled faster than any U.S. Navy fighter, and carried either 4 20mm cannons or 6 50 caliber machine guns. On a carrier deck, that power was both gift and danger. Pilots described takeoffs as controlled explosions, the Bearcat surging ahead like a catapulted shell. Yet history gave it no battlefield. It entered service in February 1945 too late. Only a handful reached operational squadrons before Japan's surrender. But those who flew it called it perfection, the smoothest handling piston fighter America ever built. After the war, it found a second life with the Blue Angels, streaking across peaceful skies in dazzling formation, its roar now a celebration rather than a warning. Across the ruined continent, Germany was birthing its own masterpiece, the Focke-Wulf Tu-152H, our number 4. If the Bearcat was a muscle of the sea, the WW152H was a blade forged for the stratosphere. Designed as a high-altitude interceptor, it had wings nearly 48 feet wide, elegant and thin, to slice through the air above 40,000 feet. Beneath its long nose sat the Junkers Jumo 213E engine, fitted with a two-stage supercharger and emergency boost system. Up there, where the world turned pale blue and Allied bombers droned like distant thunder, the WW152H could outrun nearly anything. But the beauty came too late. Only around 150 were built, as Germany's cities burned and its fuel ran dry. Pilots flew them from scattered airfields, often without proper training or maintenance. Still, those who met it in combat remembered its speed with awe. On April 14, 1945, Oberfeldwebel Willy Reschke, flying a WW152H, engaged 4 P-51 Mustangs and downed 2 before vanishing into cloud, a brief, blazing testament to what the aircraft could have been. The Bearcat and the WW152H were opposites in origin, one born from abundance, the other from desperation. Yet they shared the same heartbeat, a refusal to slow down. One represented naval precision and post-war optimism, the other, the haunting genius of an empire's last breath. Both stood at the edge of what propellers could do, chasing the horizon as the age of jets loomed just beyond the dawn. The closer the war drew to its end, the more frantic the race for speed became. Factories ran day and night, engineers tore open blueprints, and every new aircraft seemed to arrive with the same unspoken promise that one more breakthrough might tip the scales. Out of this crucible came 2 extraordinary machines, America's Republic P-47M Thunderbolt and Germany's radical Dornier Do 335 Pfeil or Arrow. At number 3, the P-47M was not so much a new fighter as a supercharged act of defiance. The Thunderbolt had already earned its reputation, rugged, heavy, and dependable. But by late 1944, the Luftwaffe had unleashed faster high-altitude fighters and even jets, and the U.S. 8th Air Force needed something that could catch them. Republic's engineers responded by stripping Lightning and reforging the mighty Jug. They fitted it with a modified Pratt & Whitney R2857 engine paired to a refined turbo supercharger and water injection system. When the pilot hit the boost raw, power flooded the cylinders, the cockpit shuddered, and the big fighter lunged forward like a released spring. In the hands of the 56th Fighter Group, the P-47M became a hammer against the Reich's dwindling air strength. Yet its power came at a price. The new engines were temperamental, prone to violent failures, until mechanics learned their secrets. For weeks, entire squadrons sat grounded waiting for spare parts that never seemed to arrive. But when the M flew, it was a revelation. Pilots spoke of the rush as the altimeter spun upward, of feeling the air thin and the sky darken to violet as they climbed after German jets. It could reach over 470 miles per hour in level flight, nearly the limit of what a piston engine could bear. And beneath that speed still lay the Thunderbolt's old virtues, 850 caliber guns armor, thick enough to bring its pilots home through storms of flak, and the resilience of an anvil turned airborne. Then came the Do 335 No. 2 on our list. A machine so strange, so ahead of its time that even seasoned pilots hesitated before climbing aboard. It looked like no other fighter of the war. 2 massive Daimler-Benz DB603 engines were mounted along the center line, one in the nose pulling the other behind the cockpit, pushing driving separate propellers in perfect synchronization. The idea was audacious: double the power without the drag of wing-mounted nacelles. In flight, the Arrow sliced through the air at nearly 474 miles per hour, serene and deadly. Its long fuselage hid an array of weapons cannons, machine guns, and even bomb racks, all balanced with remarkable precision. Test pilots found it astonishingly stable. Some called it the smoothest twin-engine aircraft they had ever flown. It even carried an emergency ejection system to clear the rear propeller, a technological marvel for 1945. But like so many of Germany's final creations, the WW335 was too late to matter. The first prototype didn't fly until late 1943, and by the time production began, the Reich was collapsing. Barely 3 dozen reached the air, most only for testing. No confirmed combat victories were ever recorded. Still, those who tested captured examples after the war were stunned. Allied pilots at Farnborough and in the U.S. described it as effortless, balanced, and a glimpse of the future. Standing beside it on the tarmac, they could sense the threshold the moment piston flight touched its ceiling and began to yield to the age of the jet. In the roar of the P-47M's turbo and the whispering thrust of the Aero's twin props, the world heard the same thing, the final crescendo of an era ending in speed, smoke, and brilliance. And finally, at the very summit of piston-driven flight, stood America's North American P-51H Mustang, the #1 fastest propeller fighter of the Second World War, and the last great breath before the jet age began. The P-51H wasn't just an improved D model. It was a complete redesign built from the bones of its famous predecessor, but stripped and refined with an almost surgical precision. Engineers shaved nearly 1,500 pounds from its frame, lightening every component that didn't serve the pursuit of speed. The fuselage was resculpted for cleaner aerodynamics, the tail enlarged for stability, and inside the nose beat a more powerful heart. The Packard-built Merlin V1650-9, a masterpiece of Anglo-American engineering with water injection for emergency power. When a test pilot pushed the throttle forward, the aircraft leapt ahead with breathtaking urgency. In level flight, it could reach nearly 487 miles per hour faster than any other propeller-driven fighter of the war. But it wasn't only quick, it was graceful. The weight reduction gave it a lighter touch on the stick, faster roll response, and a climb rate that could leave even seasoned Mustang pilots in awe. They called it the purest form of the Mustang ever built. The P-51H retained what made the Mustang legendary: its range. Over 850 miles on internal fuel meant it could escort bombers all the way to Japan and back, something no other Allied fighter could dream of. Yet, by the time production began in February 1945, history had already started to move faster than the propeller. Germany surrendered in May, Japan in August. Of the more than 500 P-51Hs produced, none saw combat before the war's end. They arrived at the threshold of peace machines built for a battle that never came. Imagine a young pilot in the summer of '45, standing beside one of these sleek silver Mustangs on an American airfield. He knows he may never fire its guns in anger. The war that summoned this machine into existence has ended, leaving it without an enemy. He runs a hand along the smooth metal skin, wondering if speed itself has finally outpaced the world's need for destruction. The P-51H marked the absolute peak of piston flight, faster, lighter, and more refined than anything before it. But it was also a farewell. Within months, jet fighters like the P-80 and the Me-262 had already redefined what fast meant. The Mustang was a king without a kingdom, its crown inherited by the cold hiss of the turbine. Still, its legacy endured. Alongside the other 7 aircraft on this list, from the FW-190 Dora to the Te-152H, from the Spitfire's graceful ferocity to the Bearcat's naval muscle, it stood as a monument to human ingenuity under pressure. Just 61 miles per hour separated the slowest from the fastest, yet each mile represented sleepless nights, bold experiments, and the quiet courage of pilots who risked everything for the promise of one more second ahead of the enemy. Speed, of course, was never everything. In the chaos of aerial combat, victory belonged not just to the fastest machine, but to the best-trained pilot, the keenest eye, and sometimes the luckiest soul. But in those desperate years, speed symbolized something deeper, the belief that progress itself could be a weapon, that in mastering the sky, humanity might somehow master its own fate. As the engines fall silent and the war recedes into memory, we are left with this 8 masterpieces of steel and flame built in a world on fire. They remind us that the pursuit of speed, however fleeting, is really the pursuit of survival, of hope, and of the fragile line between destruction and deliverance. When I look back at these machines, the Dora, the Tempest, the Mustang, I don't just see metal and engines. I see the final heartbeat of an era when courage, invention, and desperation shared the same sky. Each aircraft was a question humanity asked itself. How far can we go, and at what cost? If stories like this move you, the ones where history breathes through wings and rivets, consider subscribing. There's so much more to uncover quietly, thoughtfully together.